400 years ago, one river in Massachusetts ran so thick with herring, you could almost walk across it on their backs. 2 million fish flooding upstream every spring. Then we choked it, wall after wall, dam after dam, until barely a trickle was left, and the state literally put it in writing that this river was dead, officially, beyond saving. And then something happened on that dead water that a government report had sworn was flat out impossible.
The town brook in Plymouth has been home to many dams since the 1970s. Recently, the Plimco Dam was removed, and the water will soon flow the way nature intended.
Something biologists still struggle to explain. What came back, it wasn't just fish. So, how do you bring a river back from the dead? A starving colony. Rewind to 1621. A few dozen survivors of Plymouth Colony are clinging to the edge of a continent they barely understand, and a hard winter has already thinned their ranks. The stream running past their settlement is about to become the only thing keeping them alive. Every spring, that brook fills with river herring, small migratory fish that swim in from the Atlantic to spawn in fresh water. And here is the trick Squanto teaches them. You bury those fish in the dirt, right beside the corn seed. The herring rot. The rotting feeds the soil. The corn that grows from it feeds the colony straight through the next winter. And the harvest that follows becomes the celebration we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. Now, the version most of us learn as kids leaves out one stubborn detail. The brook was real. The fish were real. And the man who runs Plymouth's environmental department today will stand you on the bank of that exact stream, a place called Town Brook, and tell you flat out that this was the brook and these were the fish. Think about that. The founding story of the entire country is, stripped down, a story about a herring run. And to grasp how close we came to losing it forever, you first have to know what these little fish actually do. The silver engine. There are two of them, the alewife and the blueback, and scientists lump them together as forage fish, which means they sit at the exact middle of the ocean food web. They eat plankton, turning a resource almost nothing else can touch into food, and then become food for basically everything bigger than them. Striped bass, cod, and tuna hunt them. Ospreys, herons, cormorants, and eagles yank them out of the water. Seals, otters, and even whales lean on them. So, pull herring out, and the whole tower standing on top of them starts to go hungry. Here's the other thing. They are diadromous, which just means they live in salt water, but breed in fresh. Every spring, when the rivers hit the right temperature, the adults leave the ocean and run upstream to the same ponds where they were born, hauling ocean nutrients deep inland and dumping them into the forest. A herring run is basically a set of veins pumping the wealth of the sea into the land. And when a healthy run is going, the water itself looks alive. Tens of thousands of fish shoving upstream together, dark backs breaking the surface, gulls and ospreys wheeling overhead to cash in. For a few weeks every spring, a plain little stream becomes one of the most crowded bursts of life on the continent. And for thousands of years, that clockwork just ran. The Mashpee Wampanoag, who have lived in this region for more than 12,000 years, built their entire calendar around it. The silver fish coming back in spring was the start of a brand new year. And then, people started building walls. The walls rise. In 1636, colonists threw up the first dam on Town Brook to power a grist mill, right on the spot where a rebuilt mill still turns water today. And look, it seemed harmless enough. One small wall on one small stream. But a herring cannot climb a wall. To a fish that has to reach its spawning grounds or die trying, a dam is just a locked door. That first dam was a warning about what walls do to migrating fish, and nobody was reading it as one. Over the next 2 centuries, as the Industrial Revolution rolled across New England, that one warning got buried under thousands more. Massachusetts alone would end up holding more than 3,000 dams, most slapped up to spin the wheels of textile and grain mills. Everyone turned a flowing river into a stack of dead ponds and slammed another door on fish that had been making the same trip since long before the colony existed. And here is the irony that gets me. The first dam ever built in what is now the United States went up in 1640 in Scituate, just up the coast from Plymouth. And the fight to tear those walls back down would eventually be led from that same little stretch of shoreline. If you are already hooked on where this is going, do me a favor and hit subscribe. This channel digs into America's wild comebacks every single week. the animals and the places we almost lost and somehow dragged back from the edge, and subscribing is the surest way to make sure the next one actually reaches you. Because here is the heartbreaking part. The fish kept coming anyway. That is the cruel engine at the center of this whole story. A herring comes back to spawn no matter what is standing in its way. So generation after generation, they piled up below the dams, threw themselves at the concrete, and lost. To this day, you can still watch thousands of herring stack up below a barrier, hurling themselves at it for weeks, until most of the females just drop their eggs into dead water or reabsorb them entirely. An entire spawning run wiped out, and not one fish ever got caught to do it. Running the numbers. By the early 20th century, the damage finally had numbers on it, and the numbers are hard to sit with. Back in 1921, Massachusetts surveyed the Mill River in Taunton, a river where alewife had once spawned in numbers people literally called beyond belief. The report's verdict was blunt: too polluted by factory waste, too blocked by dams. Bringing the old fishery back, it declared, was an impossibility. The government had officially written the river off as dead. And if it had stopped at one dead river, the coast might have shrugged it off. But this was happening everywhere at once, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, where river herring crashed by more than 95%. The raw numbers read like typos. On the Connecticut River at the Holyoke Dam, the herring spawning upstream fell from 630,000 fish in 1985 to 21 by 2006. Just 21. And no fluke, because the St. Croix River on the Maine-Canada border told the identical story. An alewife run above 2.5 million fish in 1987, bottoming out at 22 by 2005. Commercial catches that once topped 140 million pounds a year collapsed into the low hundreds of thousands. A whole coastline, gutted inside a single lifetime. Now, dams were the biggest villain, but not the only one. Pollution poisoned the water. Fishing fleets scooped up adults out at sea. Warming oceans scrambled the signals that tell the fish when to run. People still argue over which did the most damage, but out of all of it, the walls were the one thing a community could reach into the water and rip out. By 2006, Massachusetts had seen enough and slapped a moratorium on even possessing or selling river herring. You could no longer legally take a fish that 4 centuries earlier had been so thick, a colony used it for fertilizer. Rock bottom. N-Town Brook, that founding stream, was the whole disaster shrunk down into one place you could walk in an afternoon. By the early 2000s, a run of water only 1.5 miles long was choked by 6 separate dams and barriers. The run that history pegged at up to 2 million fish, and that this brook could realistically still hold in the hundreds of thousands, had been crushed down to around 150,000. And to keep even that many alive, the volunteers got desperate. Picture this. They formed a bucket brigade. Actual people standing in the water below the dams, scooping live herring up by hand, carrying them up and over the concrete in buckets, and dumping them back in on the other side. One year, that human chain hauled more than 17,000 fish over the walls by hand. A migration 400 years old, reduced to folks lugging fish upstream in pails. Sweet in its way. Sustainable, it was not. So that was rock bottom, a founding river on life support, a whole coastline down 95%, and an official state document on the book swearing recovery was impossible. The clock had been running against these rivers for 300 years. And what almost nobody saw coming, right at the turn of the millennium, was that it was about to start ticking the other way. The first wall falls. In 2002, on Town Brook, a crew pulled out the Billington Street Dam. It was the first proactive dam removal in the history of Massachusetts, and honestly, at the time, it looked like a tiny local experiment. Yank out one useless old wall, see what the fish do. What the fish did changed everything, and removing a dam is not a gentle thing. Heavy machinery rips the concrete out. The pond behind it drains away, and a river that has been a stagnant staircase of ponds for centuries suddenly remembers how to move. The stream bed underneath, untouched since before the mills, comes back into daylight, and the fish, with no ceremony and nobody showing them how, just swim through the gap like the wall was never even there. So over the next few years, the crews kept going. They dropped the Water Street Dam and rebuilt the natural channel, In 2015, they tore out the Plymouth Dam and the old mill building bolted to it. Every removal cracked open another stretch sealed off for generations. And here is the detail that tells you what these things had become. When crews later dug into one of the town brook dams, they pulled the rusted frame of an entire car out of the foundation. That is what was strangling this river, century-old junk piles, holding back a living thing for no reason at all. And to prove it, someone finally decided to count. 94%. That someone was David Gould. As the environmental manager for the town of Plymouth, Gould had been living on this brook for years, and after the Billington Street Dam came out, he and his team did the thing that turned a local cleanup into a national blueprint. They counted. They tracked exactly how many fish made it up through the newly opened stretch, and how many made it past the next dam still standing upstream. Picture Gould out there on the bank of Town Brook, clipboard in hand, watching the water he had been fighting over for a decade. The result stopped him cold. 94% of the herring that reached the restored stretch swam straight on through. At the next dam upstream, only 6% got past. Sit with those two numbers the way Gould did that day. 94% through open water, 6% through a wall. That one comparison said more than any speech ever could. It proved, with cold hard data nobody could argue with, that the dams were the choke point, and that pulling them out was about as close to a guaranteed fix as conservation ever gets. Gould has said everyone already believed the project would work, but standing there holding the actual numbers, watching the fish pour through the gap they had opened, lit a fire under all of them. Suddenly, a modest cleanup felt like the start of something much bigger, and it was. But the tidy version of this, where a town fixes its river and everybody goes home happy, is not the real picture. The hardest dam was still standing. The Holmes Dam was the big one, the largest barrier on the brook and the keystone holding the whole mess together. Taking it out was a years-long, multi-million-dollar fight with a pointed target. Finish the bulk of the restoration by 2020, the 400th anniversary of the landing at Plymouth. In 2019, the Holmes Dam came down, and with it fell the last great wall on the founding stream. For the first time in centuries, a river herring could leave the Atlantic, swim into Town Brook, and run all the way to its spawning ponds, reaching hundreds of acres locked away since the mills. And Plymouth was only the beginning. The comeback spreads. Because Town Brook was never the only experiment. While Plymouth was pulling its dams, the same idea was being tested all over Massachusetts, and the results started landing like a drum roll. Remember the Mill River in Taunton, the one the state pronounced dead back in 1921? Between 2012 and 2018, crews yanked out 3 of the dams strangling it and built a fish ladder at a 4th. And in the spring of 2018, cameras caught the first river herring to swim up the Mill River in more than 200 years. The fishery a government report had called flat out impossible was, almost a century later, alive again. The report was just wrong. It only took 100 years and a lot of heavy machinery to prove it. But the real gut punch is the Mystic River, which runs through the most paved-over urbanized watershed in all of New England, the dense suburbs just north of Boston. You would bet money the most concrete-choked river in the region was the most hopeless. Instead, it became the biggest comeback of them all. When volunteers started counting herring at the Mystic Lakes Dam in 2012, they figured the run at around 200,000 fish. They kept opening fish passage, and the number kept climbing. By 2024, the Mystic Herring Run hit an estimated 815,000 fish, the largest river herring migration ever recorded in the state, in its most developed watershed. And to put 815,000 in your head, biologists worked out that lined up nose to tail, that column of fish would stretch close to 100 miles. A river of herring 100 miles long, pouring back into a river everybody had given up on. And the momentum did not stop at any one stream. In 2025, the United States pulled out 100 dams in a single year, reconnecting nearly 5,000 miles of river, the most ever reopened in this country in 1 year. Massachusetts alone ripped out 11. Since the state stood up its Ecological Restoration Division, it has run more than 150 projects, removed over 50 dams, and reconnected roughly 700 miles of river. None of it was cheap. A single removal runs into the millions. way more than any dam owner could cover alone, which is why state agencies, federal money, and conservation groups had to carry it. Every reopened mile is a public bet that a living river is worth more than a dead wall. And what that bet buys back is bigger than fish. What comes back? Because when a herring run comes back, it never comes back alone. The ospreys return to hunt it. The striped bass follow it back inshore. The eggs in the spent adults feed turtles, eagles, otters, and mink. The ocean nutrients the fish drag upstream soak into the stream bed and feed the whole freshwater system from the bottom up. One restored run quietly restocks an entire food web that had been running on empty. The herring were always the foundation, and rebuild the foundation, and everything stacked on top of it starts to stand again. And for the Wampanoag, the return meant something the numbers can never fully hold. The herring showing up each spring had marked the new year for more than 12,000 years. As the runs came back, so did the Herring Day gatherings, where elders teach the next generation why the silverfish matter and why the estuaries that shelter them must be protected. A broken link 12,000 years old, stitched back together one dam at a time, and the work is not done. On Town Brook, crews broke ground in late 2025 on a nature-like bypass channel that will route the fish around the last historic dam, the one at the 1636 mill site the town chose to keep instead of demolish. And that compromise tells you everything about how this actually gets done. They kept the historic mill standing, and they built the fish a path around it. History and river finally learning to share the same water. But the biggest lesson from all of it is still coming. The silver returns. 400 years ago, a stream in Massachusetts ran so thick with silver, it could feed a colony and fertilize its fields. Then we spent 3 centuries proving we could choke it down to a trickle so thin, a state report called it dead and meant it. And then, with nothing fancier than excavators, patience, and a willingness to count the fish honestly, we proved that report dead wrong. The silver is coming back. Not 2 million strong, not yet, maybe not ever. But on rivers everyone had written off, the spring run has returned, and the whole food web it carries is rebuilding right behind it. And here is the thing that stays with me. The impossible part was never the comeback. It was believing for 300 years that a wall was permanent. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and stick around, because we cover America's wild comebacks every week, and the next one is already on the way. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you could tear one wall out of one river near you and bring a lost run roaring back to life, which river would you pick, and what do you think would come back first?